Hello and welcome to Jewish History Lab. We're going to continue today with more of a discussion on the literary, philosophical, religious level, looking at a stage in intellectual literary development that's related to a population called the Acharonim, sometimes spelled Acharonim. Literally, that term means the latter ones, like the latter authorities, the later authorities, and it's a contrast to their predecessors known as the Rishonim, who are called the first ones, whom we spoke about in a previous class. So let's go in and try to understand who exactly are the Acharonim and what are they all about. So let me remind you of a discussion we had in a previous lecture about this notion of the decline of the generations. In Hebrew, Yeridat Hadorot, the decline of the generations. There's this idea, which is religious, philosophical, that the closer a population was to the moment of revelation at Sinai, shown here, by the way, in this great picture of Charlton Heston as Moses in the great Cecil B. DeMille classic, which had a big influence on me, really. I was overwhelmed when I first saw this movie. At any rate, there's this idea that, at that moment when God spoke to the Jewish people as described in the Bible, and they all said, wow, and well, there's a lot to say about that. That was like the greatest sort of spiritual sensitivity on a large population that had ever occurred in human history. And it's all been downhill since then, right? As we go further and further away in time from that revelation at Sinai, according to Jewish theology, people get less and less spiritually sensitive. Now, this does not mean that they become less intelligent. In fact, there's a very basic principle that goes along with the decline of the generations, that later generations are considered more authoritative for a host of reasons that will not concern us here, but basically much more familiarity with social innovations, technological innovations are big. More of a grasp of material that might not have been available to earlier generations. Just on a simple technical level, like my phone has the entire Talmud and all of its commentaries that have ever been digitized on it right here on the palm of my hand. So in many ways, I here living in the 21st century have at my moment's reach books that 500 years ago most scholars would never have been able to see because they were existing only in manuscript, and so on. This is not the place to have a discussion of this philosophical concept, but the notion that in Jewish history, many of the more traditional historiographies really count populations in the terms of how far away they are from Sinai. So we have, for example, the generation of Sinai, which is called the Dor Dea, the generation of knowledge, because they were filled, to quote Isaiah, with the knowledge of God, despite the behavior that's described in the Bible. Then you have, and I'm just going to summarize some of the major levels. The post-Babylonian exile, which represents a big step down, but nevertheless still living in the temple era, second temple era, of course. Then you have the Tanaim, or the scholars associated with the Mishnah, and this goes right up into the 3rd century, the early 3rd century, and then they're followed by the Amoraim, who are the main scholars associated with the Talmud. And as I mentioned, I'm skipping over kind of like subdivisions within these generations. Sometime after the Amoraim, then you have the so-called Rishonim, the first ones. And they represent such a significant shift in the type of thinking and the types of things that they did for research that we have a whole lecture alone on the Rishonim. I encourage you to go back in the series and listen to that if you want to know more about the Acharonim, but that's where we are right now. The Acharonim are the scholars who lived after the 16th century, and they are in many ways quite distinct from the Rishonim. We haven't had anyone really innovate a new term for late 20th, early 21st century thinkers, but we might be getting close to that, as I hope to discuss at the end of this brief discussion. Let's think about, well, what exactly are the Acharonim now? What exactly did they do that's different from the Rishonim? So the characteristics of the Acharonim, this is something that, I haven't read a lot about it, and I just had to sort of think to myself about what it's like studying the writings of Acharonim as opposed to the study of writings of Rishonim. And I can say three things. First of all, they tend to write super commentaries rather than commentaries, meaning rather than write a commentary on the Talmud itself, on the Bible itself, on the Mishnah itself, they tend to write commentaries that, even when they are based on that core text, they're widely cognizant of a much broader literature. By way of contrast, for example, Maimonides will quote directly from the Talmud. He's a Rishon, but he will not spend a lot of time talking about other commentators on the Talmud. He will really base his halachic discussions based on his own assessment of how to understand the Talmud itself. Whereas super commentaries will be commentaries on Maimonides on the Talmud. So it tends to be sort of a meta-analysis rather than a first-order analysis. That's also, I think, very much characteristic of modern research in general, that you have to do like kind of a literary survey. Who else has written on this topic and what did they say? That's the kind of thing that Acharonim tend to do, much more so, in my humble opinion, than Rishonim. Secondly, in terms of their expression, they are almost always written in Rabbinic Hebrew. There's some interesting non-Rabbinic Hebrew Acharonim, but the vast majority are writing in Rabbinic Hebrew. And their language is still coded, but not nearly as cryptic as the Rishonim. When I went to yeshiva, I went to Or Sameach, a traditional Lithuanian-style yeshiva, we spent almost all our time learning how to decode Rishonim. The Ritva, the Rashba, and so on. And then when we got to Acharonim, it was like all of a sudden we went so fast. Even though we were reading so much more text, covering so much more mileage, the language was just kind of like a breath of fresh air. In the Rishonim, every single syllable, every single little jot and tittle in the text means so much, and you have to pause and you have to contemplate what it means and what are the possible ambiguities, whereas in the writings of the Acharonim tend to be far more straightforward, less cryptic, more prolix. They tend to be much more, longer. They take a lot more words to say something, but more words helps with the precision and rapid understanding. And then third, in general, they tend to lean towards the pragmatic. The Acharonim still deal with theoretical questions, but those theoretical questions are not pure theory. They tend to be linked to an actual situation. They tend to be linked to a specific question that was raised about a real life case, and they will use all of this other body of information that they've accumulated in order to bring it to bear on that particular issue. Those are three characteristics that, in my humble opinion, are associated with the Acharonim. It may be helpful in this context to sort of look at the first author who is widely considered as the sort of the initiator of this era, a liminal character whose writings really straddle the period of the Rishonim and the period of Acharonim. And this is, of course, none other than Maran Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, as this book and subtitle explains. Now, who was this individual? He was a fantastic scholar, remarkable legal scholar, also a Kabbalist, as we shall see in the next lecture, God willing. And he is the author of the most widely used code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, or the Set Table. However, why don't we call him Maran, which is a title of respect, like our rabbi? Why don't we call him Maran Shulchan Aruch? Why do we call him Maran Beit Yosef? Also, by the way, he's known as HaMechaber, the author, as if to say, this is really the model of all authorship. So the reason is because his magnum opus is not the Shulchan Aruch. And in fact, he placed much less emphasis on the importance of the Shulchan Aruch. His greatest work of scholarship is undoubtedly this incredible work called the Beit Yosef, which is a Rishon-style commentary on an earlier code called the Tur. And what he does with the Tur is he begins this kind of meta-analysis, but he really goes deeply into the sources, once again using the kind of pragmatic tools to draw out the theoretical foundations of the decisions as laid down in the Tur. Now, amazingly, he went and he wrote commentaries on other great codes, such as Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, and when he had finished all of these, only then did he go on to write the Shulchan Aruch, which he clearly intended, actually, not as the primary text to be studied. He hoped that people would study his Beit Yosef and his Kesef Mishnah, other works like that, on other great commentaries. The Shulchan Aruch was intended to be kind of like a short form of all of the decisions that were reached after having discussed all of the previous codes. And he actually intended for people to review it every 30 days. Can you imagine studying the entire Shulchan Aruch every month? But that's really what he was. It was kind of like a short form. It was a concise version of the much longer Rishon style, but in terms of thinking, that he put into his earlier commentaries. So the Beit Yosef is considered widely the last work of the Rishon era, and the Shulchan Aruch, by the same author, is considered the initial book of the period of the Acharonim. He also had a fantastic and amazing life, which also straddled, the great Iberian Jewish population. He was among the exiles from the Spanish expulsion. As a child, he wandered throughout Europe, and he was in Constantinople and ended up in Sfat, which, again, I hope to speak about in the very next lecture. Fascinating figure. So that's sort of like what the Acharonim are all about. Let me just ask one last question. What about the period we're in right now? It's been a long time, 5 centuries, that we have been thinking about Acharonim and writing like Acharonim. Is there something new? Are we in a post-Acharon period? So there are definitely Acharonim who are still alive and well and working with us. Rabbi Chaim Kamenetsky is one of the greatest rabbis, very widely respected, currently living in Israel, whose work clearly belongs within the genre of the Acharonim. But there's an interesting kind of development that, again, I'm kind of going out on a limb here. This is not really my area of expertise. They say that historians shouldn't talk too much about our own times because we're like pressing our windows up against the glass. But when I look at like new books on Jewish thought, particularly in Halacha, which is where, in Jewish law, where the Acharonim tend to be concentrated the most, I see an interesting phenomenon of hyper-specialization, partially assisted by technology, because now, if you want to find everything that's ever been written on even the most arcane subject, it's simply a Google search away. Obviously, there are some specialized databases and so on, but it's accessible. And so all of a sudden, a person can accumulate an incredibly broad grasp of what has ever anywhere been written about a specific issue and write a book about how these things come to pass. I'll give you one example, which is kind of amazing. I'm sure many of you who are watching this are familiar with the custom that on the holiday of Hanukkah, one should eat foods associated with oil, right? The oil is put in the Chanukiah, the candelabra, and so on. So one of the most common foods is potato latkes and also donuts, which are known in Hebrew as sufganiyot. So in Israel and in Jewish neighborhoods all over the world, you'll see lots and lots of sufganiyot that are baked and available for this holiday. They tend not to be, at least in recent times, they tend not to be what most Americans think of as donuts. They don't have a hole in them, but they are hollow, and they're typically filled with jelly or custard or something like that. I know you don't really want to hear about this, but there's a reason for this. And just a couple of years ago, this remarkable, perhaps post-Acharonic work came out, so-called Sefer Emek HaSufganim, the book of the Valley of the Donuts. And the subtitle reads that it's all about the custom of eating donuts on the holiday of Hanukkah. And it's a massive tome, actually, hundreds of pages, all about eating donuts on Hanukkah. So part of me wants to think that this is clearly post-Aharonic, that we have gotten to such a level of specificity and detail that we can produce these massive works of Jewish law and thought related to something as prosaic as eating donuts. And it remains to be seen what's next. I mean, what are the post-Acharonim like? I don't know how long this can last. I have a feeling there's some great thing on the horizon, but we'll just have to wait and see. At any rate, I hope you found this brief lecture useful. If you did, please consider subscribing or getting involved in the channel. It's really nice to see so many people really interested in Jewish history. Thank you very much for watching.